Welcome everyone and everyone online. My name is Bo Hayden and I'm the Executive Director for the Tusher Strategic Initiative for Technology Leadership. And welcome you today to our seminar on unlocking the productivity puzzle. I'm going to be the moderator for today. I'm going to try to do what moderators should do best is not be seen and heard too much, but I'm a little bit difficult not to see, but I'll try to manage that process. The agenda for today is very simple. I'm going to hand over shortly to Professor Teece to talk a bit about intro into the subject for today. And then we'll have a paper presentation by Giovanni and Enrica and discussants by Riita and Greg. And then we'll have a short break. And then we'll come back and have a keynote by Brian Arthur. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion. And then that'll wrap it up for today. So it's great to have everyone here. And without spending too much more time, I'd like to welcome David. Sir.
Well, thank you, Bo, and welcome guests. I've got a little bit of laryngitis, so I won't be speaking for too long in case I can't speak. But Giovanni, it's always a delight to welcome you back to campus. We have all been impacted by your research, and I was recently in Pisa to celebrate the launch of what he modestly calls a handbook on dynamic, on innovation. As I told him, it shouldn't be called a handbook because that implies that there are easy answers, and there are no easy answers. It should more appropriately be called an encyclopedia on micro and macro innovation or something of that kind. And indeed, today we are going into an important chapter in the discussion of innovation and its role in the economy by looking at the productivity dilemma. And it's really a two-faced dilemma. One part of the dilemma is that the Western world has very low productivity growth, if any. And in fact, in some countries, it's going backwards. And we need to understand that. The other part of the dilemma, and I say this as an economist, we can't explain much of the productivity dilemma. And nothing could be more important to the world today. I was reading in today's Financial Times as Germany thinks of suddenly paying for its fair share of defense and upping defense expenditure to 2 or 3% of GDP or whatever it settles upon. Where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from social programs. It has to. There's no other place for it to come from. And so countries are struggling more so than ever with how to juice more productivity out of the economy so they don't have to sacrifice programs that they like in order to support new programs that they may need. So the burden is on us as scholars to help. And I think whether we're talking about the economics profession or other professions, we've done pathetically little. I just sort of want to make a couple of big points and one small point about how I see the need to move forward here. One is, on the economic side, there has sort of been clearly a recognition that innovation is a driver of productivity. But as Solow said, 20 or so years ago when computing arrived, well, we see computing everywhere except in the numbers. In other words, that innovation itself didn't automatically translate through into productivity improvements. And it took a number of folks, and in particular, Paul David, our colleague at Stanford, to do important work that showed that it took a whole bunch of complementary investments to make innovation really pay off in terms of its impact on productivity. So that was a significant step forward, although I don't think the mainstream productivity literature has gone very far, notwithstanding that important insight. Now, there are some observations that come through from the economics literature on productivity, and one is that there's enormous heterogeneity amongst firms. Now, that should set off bells and whistles in business schools. Okay, this has got something to do with management, perhaps. But notwithstanding that, there has not been a lot of research on productivity from business schools. There's been some. You know, we are left with the observation that there is this extreme heterogeneity, but we can't explain it other than to say that management matters. And Nicholas Bloom at Stanford managed to get $10 million from somewhere at the Harvard Business School to do this major study, which showed that different management approaches led to different outcomes in terms of productivity. But when you look more closely at what he's looking at, these are old technologies. It's a static story. So it's not surprising to me that productivity studies haven't gone very far in economics, in part because, you know, innovation has been on the sidelines and efficiency has been front and center. You know, economists love to focus, as they should, on efficiency, but they shouldn't focus on it exclusively. And there's a big literature in management that says that efficiency and innovation are often, but not always, at war with each other. So if you have efficiency, if you push for efficiency, you don't necessarily get innovation. But you might. And to me, in this, you know, if the first big insight is Paul David's concept about the role of complementary investments, the second big insight, in my view, is that it takes managerial capabilities of a different kind to drive productivity. And in particular, it requires dynamic capabilities. Why dynamic capabilities? Because you've constantly, particularly in a world of change, got to be reallocating your resources inside the corporation. Otherwise, you're going to be producing things that customers don't want, which are indirectly going to create low productivity numbers because you won't be at a price high, and you will end up producing commodity products, and indirectly, commodity products, you know, aren't going to lift labor productivity because you're not going to be able to squeeze much juice out of it. So the productivity numbers are driven by gross margins, and to me, it's amazing that no one has really tied the analysis of margins in the enterprise to the question of productivity. Surprisingly obvious thing to do. I'm sure there's one or two papers out there, but it's certainly not a mainstream issue, and it's not a major issue. So, you know, I was thinking about this once again as I was reading the Financial Times today and seeing Apple deciding to not necessarily abandon, but to substantially reallocate all of its resources from autonomous vehicles into AI. Now, that to me, you know, time will tell, of course, is potentially an illustration of dynamic capabilities, a recognition that where the high-valued stuff is over there in AI, that there's too much competition and it's probably going to be slow to get adoption in autonomous vehicles because it depends on, in the Paul David sense, a huge number of complementarities. And the huge complementarities there are nation states and local authorities that will enable and allow you to use autonomous cars. And if you don't have certain sensors and what have you in the road, which requires cooperation from others, it's not going to go anywhere. So we should be in a position here in the School of Business, since there's 100 years of essential failure to explain productivity very well in economics, we should be in a position in business schools to tie this together. And I think the capabilities framework lets you out of the trap. You know, economists are blinded. Until you adopt the capabilities story, you're not going to look at the things that really matter. And in particular, you're going to assume the companies are allocating the resources the right way all the time, because that's the optimality structure that's behind economics. So you have to break out of that optimality structure and recognize, as Richard Nelson and Brian Arthur and many others have told us, that, you know, the world is one that's very imperfect and where there's deep uncertainty and where it's not optimizing behavior that allows firms to succeed. So, and let me give a shout out to both Richard, who's here, as he is often, because of tonight's event and the award of the Nelson Prize, and then for Brian Arthur for coming and joining us and being a visiting scholar here for the next several months. So I feel that we are in a position, the invitation is there, the opportunity is there for us to think anew about deep questions that are absolutely fundamental to our society, and get to work to try and break them down. And by being critical of economics, I'm not saying that any other field has got this right either. And in fact, in thinking about the issue today, I went back and found this nice paper in the Journal of Operations Management called Perspectives on the Productivity Dilemma, authored by Paul Adler, Mary Benner, John Paul McDuffie, Hiro Takeuchi, Mike Tushman, Sid Winter. And you read it. You know, they blunt their pick on the rock, too. They don't get very far, other than pointing out what's at least obvious in the management literature, that efficiency and innovation are sometimes at war with each other. There's no great insight into the productivity literature that flows out of this. So a few people are trying. I think the elements are there for young scholars in particular to really show us how to do this. And today, Giovanni, well, you're not a young scholar, you're with a young scholar, and so there's a reasonable chance that we'll get some new insights that will lead us forward so that we can help society move forward with one of its, if not its most difficult problem.
Great. Thanks a lot, David, for setting the scenes. So now I'd like to welcome Giovanni Dosi, professor at Sant'Anna School for Advanced Studies, and Enrica Virgillito, associate professor at Sant'Anna as well. Thanks, Giovanni. I thought for sure I was at an event where you retired, but it's good to see that you didn't really do it and you're still writing things again. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's always nice to be here among friends. The first time I was here was 1986, David? Yeah, 1986, so it's a long time. Yes, what we'll try to tackle here is the relationship between corporate performance and capabilities, organizational capabilities. I'm afraid that we'll focus on very boring static capabilities. That is the relatively invariant procedures that firms embody. After all, business organization do things. I mean, they build cars, they write software, and sometimes, not all of them, sometimes also they search for new type of cars, new drugs, they search for innovation. Now, in doing that, they have internal procedures and procedures that relate them to customers, to clients. One of the hypotheses that has been pursued since at least Nelson and Winter's seminal book is that firms are characterized by routines and heuristics that are relatively invariant over time. Sid Winter calls them quasi-genetic trait, in the sense that they are relatively sticky, inertial state variables. And they constrain also the strategic choices that are open to the management. Now, a tricky discussion is how much they constrain management decision degrees of freedom. And this is probably where we are going to have a discussion, David and us, on how plastic is the organization to the management decision. Because there is, in fact, this tension between what is relatively invariant, the way we do things here, and the things that we would like to do. Now, we call, Winter, Nelson, the previous reincarnation of David, when he was less dynamic and more capabilities. The organizational capabilities are is a collective name for the properties of this combination of procedure heuristics, both externally and internally. Not pushing the metaphor too far, think of these relative invariant capabilities as the genotype, and think of their expression as the phenotype, without pushing it too far in the analogy. But think of the phenotype that is the expression of these quasi-genetic traits in terms of performances, including, of course, productivity. Now, the difficulty is that often one uses tautological definition of capabilities, because one says, well, what is a capability? Capability is doing things well. How do you measure doing things well? With productivity, say. And so basically you measure something with itself. As Enrica will detail in a while, we exploit a very rich data bank from the Italian Statistical Office that is, to my knowledge, is the first that is procedurally focused, that is on what firms do and how they do it, and not in terms of balance sheet. So our attempt is to map this ensemble of procedure into the revealed performances of the firms. In doing that, of course, avoiding any tautological reasoning. Now, here is probably another point of discussion with David. How much, to what extent one can define managerial best practices. If one stick to the notion of capabilities as a combinatorics among several procedures, one can hardly define one best way, because capabilities are the collective, are the matching between all these organizational behaviors. This is a bit the contrary to what Bloom and Van Renen and others say, and basically they claim that the quality of management has unlimited degrees of freedom, or almost. And second, that they had the hypothesis that the lower is the number of the layers, of our hierarchical layers, the better it is. because that makes the organization more agile, more responsive, etc. We don't believe it. I mean, otherwise the most agile society would have been ancient Egypt, in which you had the pharaoh and then the people down with very few layers in between. Should have been the most agile and flexible organization. It was exactly the opposite. In the capability view that we borrow from Winter Halfat, from the previous reincarnation of David, organizational capabilities are higher level collection of routines that govern the flows of input, the flows of information, and the relationship between with customers, with suppliers. A capability is a property of repeated action. Now, to repeat, the issue is how much strategic management can influence these capabilities. What we do is to try to make a picture of these relatively invariant characteristics of the organization and sort of taxonomize them. The further claim that we make is that you can map different capabilities in different productivities and different rate of growth of productivity by firms. David was mentioning the productivity slowdown. This productivity slowdown is associated in all Western countries to different degrees, is associated with an increased heterogeneity. Is under the chair, David. An increasing heterogeneity across firms, irrespective of the level of disaggregation. So it's not that you compare apple with pears, but even if you zoom in at very detailed disaggregation, you get still very high heterogeneity. I mean, Syverson, a few years ago, Journal of Economic Literature, finds that in a very, very boring activity, steel coils, and there's nothing more boring than steel coils. Steel coils, the ratio top-bottom in terms of labor productivity is 4:1. 4:1 in the United States. And in fact, investigation that we did on Europe, on France, Italy, the ratio is between 8:1 to 4:1 at three-digit disaggregation. In China, when liberalization started, the ratio was typically 15:1. And catching up involved a decrease in this variance, but not too much. It got down to 12:1, 10:1. In fact, our claim is that this heterogeneity rests in different capabilities. And this heterogeneity has increased also because, we shall see later, also because wages have become more dispersed. With wages becoming more dispersed, in fact, you induced a much lower selection because you allowed firms low productivity firms, to to pay low wages and survive. In fact, wage equality is, apart from issues of social justice, is a powerful selective instrument. Much more powerful than competition, in fact. Now, I mean, we prove this in the data, in other works, and we also prove it formally, that when selection is low, heterogeneity increases, and there is an inverse relation between, a direct relation between dispersion of wages and dispersion in productivity. Now, to repeat, and I pass the floor to Enrica, we mean to check to taxonomize the procedure that are part of the first specific capabilities, and then independently map these taxonomies of capabilities into the performances in terms of productivity levels and growth, and employment level and growth. Enrica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will stand up if you don't mind. So now the second part of this presentation is actually meant to give an operationalization of how we try to identify those genes into the let's say, the structure and performance of firms. To do that, we use two data sources that are quite interesting in terms of the knowledge detail that is incorporated into that. The first is the permanent business census, and we use actually the second wave of this census. It covers, actually is a so-called multi-purpose survey. So when Giovanni was saying it is a survey that's trying to convey structured knowledge, it's because it's a survey that is administered to over 200,000 firms with more than 3 persons, and it covers a series of sections that you see has governance, so including ownership, management, participation to multinational corporation, human capital, and this is a section for us very much important in terms of investment, skills, competencies, inter-firm relations, such as contracting, subcontracting, partnership, competitiveness strategies, in terms of how do firms set prices, how do they try to reach quality, how do they intend their innovation strategies, how do they set location, which are their networks, technology. There is a section on technology use, in particular ICT and Industry 4.0 technologies. The wave I'm presenting, it was 2018, so it was still in the so-called fourth industrial revolution phase. The new wave of the census now clearly uncovers a lot of AI questions. There is finance in it, so sources, bank, firm relationship, type and condition, and there is clearly internationalization. So you end up with a big source of information that are, if you want, qualitative information, and what we did was trying to inform some structured knowledge from this qualitative information into what? Into performances. So we use the second data set, that is the structured business survey. It's a business register covering more than 4 million firms operating in Italy, reporting information mainly on balance sheets. So you have size, industry location, again you have composition of workers and performance. So you can look at profit and loss account, you can look at participation in international trade in terms, for example, of export. Once we integrated the two data sets, we end up with a sample of around 100,000 firms. We decided to focus on more than 10 employees. That was our target, because the idea is to have a minimum number of employees to have an organizational structure, representative of a universe that is around 200,000 units. It covers 9 million persons employed, which is more or less 55% of the total. It covers around 557 billion euros of value added, 70% of the total economy. It's quite good, and it covers a lot of large enterprises, so enterprises with more than 250 employed people, generating more or less 40% of the overall employment and 45% of total value added. Why I'm saying that? Because I wanted to, let's say, convince you that the final sample is somehow representative. Now, let's see the empirical strategy that we follow. It's really theory-informed, as Giovanni was trying to explain, and data-driven in a multi-step way. So having to facing the issue of trying to synthesize a complexity structure that is in the data set, in the qualitative data set, we start first of all with a factor analysis on relevant variables of this questionnaire that are actually questions that are administered to firms. So first, identifying factors to do dimensionality reduction. The second step we did was to go from let's say, reduction of dimensionality into mapping, separation of information by means of a cluster analysis. And this is, let's say, the link between the genotype and the phenotype. Then we look at the co-occurrences and persistence of the practices that the firms were able to, let's say, signal by means of their replies. Then we perform a taxonomy of industrial structure because we went from firm into sectors, and we look at the so-called Pavitian taxonomy. Then a regression analysis just to quantify the effect of capabilities on productivity and employment. And finally, we want to, let's say, enrich the discussion, having some information about the dynamics of firms during the pandemic. So we look at some persistency in terms of this gene, on how those firms reacted during the pandemics, and some information on the quality of employment. So just to give you the results of this multi-step strategy, we identified 3 main factors that you can understand as forms of, let's say, elements of the genotype of the firms. The first is the factor accounting for 46% of the total variance out of a selection of 40 questions into this questionnaire. So the questionnaire is much bigger. We selected, when I said it's theory informed, because we just focus on some of them. You can say it's arbitrary. Yes, everything is arbitrary in research design. So the section on which we focus were ownership, human resources, relation between firms and other entities, market, technology, new trajectories of development, environmental sustainability. Across all these sections, we identified 40 questions. We did a factor analysis. First factor is what we labeled as complexity of firms in terms of techno-organizational capability. It explained 40%, more than 40% of the total variance across firms, and it's the first factor that for us it's important to identify the genotype. The second factor is what we call the managerial strategies, the third relation. Why is that? Because the first factor actually come out from the intersection of those let's say, multi-set of information that are included into the data set. So when we talk about techno-organizational capability, we identify information related to staff training activities, so a lot of stuff related to how knowledge is generated inside the firms, investment in advanced automation and interconnected machine, investment in technology and digitalization. These are information that were unrelated into the questionnaire that then, let's say, were grouped by means of the factor analysis. The second type of factor is called managerial strategies because it's mainly related to how product quality is defined by the firms and how competitive strategies are set, market power in terms of price setting, and expansion strategies. So for us was more related to the standard way in which we conceive how managerial strategies should behave. The third one is instead a very interesting factor because it's related to network of relations of the firm, both inside, so how the employer let's say, manage what is, let's say, the workforce, so adoption of practices for the staff, professional development and equal opportunity protection, so all the form of internal labor market of the firm, plus all, let's say, benefits that the firm gives to his own employee, and then also relation of articulation intercompany, so how forms of contract, subcontracting agreements are developed. There are details into the paper. I won't go into that. The second step that we did, as I told you, was to make distinction. So after dimensionality reduction, we map differences of this industrial structure into 4 clusters of firms that we label essential, managerial, interdependent, and complex, according to the ranging, to the way in which the first factor of complex, let's say, techno-complexity capability evolve across the firms. And I have details if you are interested, but what I would like you to show you here, what I would like to focus here is this distinction. So first of all, in terms of representativeness of the 4 factors, where you can, let's say, imagine the first 2 has low complexity cluster, and the other 2 has high complexity cluster, you see that in general the proportion of low complexity cluster is much higher, vis-à-vis those of the high complexity cluster, and you see a strong scaling in terms of the performance. So this is where we try to do the link between genotype and phenotype, because here you see a quite neat scaling in terms of value added and in terms of productivity. So in pre-pandemic times, this was a period before the pandemic, what we see was that 2/3 of Italian firms are located in the cluster that we labeled essential or managerial firms, so with low level of techno-organizational complexity in it, but they generate just 1/3 of total value added. We see very few firms that we define as complex, less than 10%, that clearly account for more than 43% of total value added. The productivity of complex firm is twice as the level of essential, that is, if you want, the 2 antipodal type of cluster of firms, and we see large heterogeneity between, but clearly not within, the classes in average salaries. Why not within? Because the cluster analysis is clearly meant to group of firms that are together. So if I cluster them, I should find homogeneity. Now, just to give you an idea of the practices of those firms. So when we look at the low, let's say, complex firms in pre-pandemic time, when you see these low investment rates popping up, it's basically the practices, the type of response that was more abundant and that was able to differentiate this cluster, that is the essential, the low productivity cluster, emerging. When you look at the behavior of the very same firm during the pandemic, okay, you see that the reply that they had, the response during the pandemic was basically difficulty in raising financial resources, hard reorganization of the production, difficulty in defining strategies. Let me show you what the upper part of the distribution did, how complex firms were reacting before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So those those complex firms during the pre-pandemic phase, they were strongly focused on what? On industrial revolution, upskilling, R&D partnership, ICT provider, fourth industrial revolution, so on and so called, robotics, R&D. What are, again, those are the practices that were emerging from the structured questionnaire. Let us see how did react into the pandemic. Look at this, increased EU export, and what they did was also hiring. What they did was Industry 4.0 and business model. So they had an idea of doing some forms of restructuring inside let's say, the crisis, but reacting with some potential good strategies. So from one side, incapacity to react. From the other side, good capacity to react, even inside a crisis that was very much pervasive. Just to give you, let's say, a corollary evidence that we find that complexity is not size. So we were able to identify, even inside small firms, sorry for that, attribute of complexity, okay? Just trying to go into the final part of the presentation. Whenever you look at the industrial composition, so if you want to go at the industrial sectoral level and you want to see how those firms are located in terms of sectors, you see that basically low-level complexity clusters, so essential and managerials, mainly belong to traditional manufacturing, textile, wearing, apparel, leather, and food. And then when you look at the high-level complexity cluster, you see actually emerging what you would expect: pharmaceutical, electronics, chemistry, scale-intensive industry. The same type of scaling we see also in services. I don't want to spend much more time on that. Then we did an analysis that actually was a confirmatory analysis in terms of the relevance of this techno-organizational capability, so what we define complexity in terms of productivity. And again, you see that when you have as a dependent variable level productivity and as a benchmark essential firm defined as the low complexity cluster, you see this quite good scaling in terms of the effect of being one cluster ahead vis-a-vis the low complexity cluster in terms of the gains in productivity that you have. This, again, applies independently of the size. And when you look among large enterprises, what we call the managerial firm, they do show more or less an effect, a performance in terms of productivity quite similar to the benchmark essential. Then let me jump into the dynamics of growth. So when we look not simply at productivity levels, but at change in 2016-2018, let me say here that we have updated in the paper the information on productivity, adding other years in order to avoid any contemporaneous form of information between the productivity dynamics and our indicator of, let's say, complexity. And what we see when we look at the dynamics of both productivity and employment is that interdependent and complex firms experience higher growth in productivity. And you can see again here, you see independently, you see in small size firms. What is instead emerging for employment is that let's say complexity is more effective, and here I'm losing the pointer. So is when you focus on larger firms, the effect is stronger in terms of employment. So in the recovery phase, for medium and large firms, organizational capability is reflected more in employment growth rather than in productivity growth. I think I'm over. It's right, or do I have just 1 minute more? If I have, I can show some further evidence. Otherwise, I can stop. No, okay. No, just one section that is not actually in the paper, but that I would like to show you with you, and it's really this focus on employment, it is that the type of effect that those firms have in terms of employment is not simply in terms of quantity, but is also in terms of quality. In the sense that when we look here, we are looking at the structure of occupation in terms of what in US you called SOC code. So here in Italy we have the so-called ISCO classification. In US you have the SOC classification. So here is the hierarchical structure in terms of occupation: elementary occupation, plant and machine operators, craft-related trades worker, so on and so forth, until technician, professional, and managers. So when you look at those complex firms, you see that, okay, clearly there is a scaling in the type of the structure of occupation that they are able to absorb. And what you see is that in general, when we look at the entire structure of the economy, the highest incidence in new activated jobs, here I'm just looking at new activated jobs, is in service and sale workers. So occupations that are not very strongly valued in terms of wages. When you look at the occupation at the top of the hierarchies, those are mainly, let's say, demanded by complex and interdependent firms, and you see here. During the pandemic times, what you see is that newly activated jobs, again, the sectoral restructuring, were largely in elementary occupation and occupation in the bottom part of the hierarchy, and complex firms present more termination than job activation. So what they did during the pandemic was trying to have a sort of selective restructuring. So we did a multinomial type of analysis, putting together variation in terms of what we call it upskilling, so in terms of upgrading in the upgrading in the occupational composition and in terms of employment. And we look again at the behavior of those firms, and the results tell us that during the pandemic crisis, basically higher complexity was a mark that allow firms to get, in any case, a higher share of high-skilled employee, and when employment decreases, more complex firms, they do show low probability of downskilling. Here I'm closing, and let's say, the part of the results. Then Giovanni, I think, should bring the final conclusion, so we can switch again the mic, and trying to recap all the mess I did. So...
Well, something that one of the findings that is rightly controversial is that our proxies of organizational capabilities appear to be more important than the proxy for the strategic orientation, which is somewhat puzzling. The taxonomy, to repeat what Mike said before, is not a size taxonomy. There are small firms that are complex in our definition, and there are big firms that are essential, that is poor, and and is, of course, is not unrelated to the sector. But all sectors present the varieties across these four types. Now, there are two important things. One is that these characteristics are persistent, and in the second wave, around 2/3 of the firms remain in the same cluster. So this is 3/4 remain in the same cluster. So this claim that our quasi-genetic traits is not far-fetched. This, of course, militates in favor of new dualism, because there is no trend in washing out the bad firms. The pandemic did not have much effect, washing effect. Complex firm, in our definition, have higher productivity, more higher growth in employment, and a quality of employment that is of much higher than essential firms. So, I mean, this, I think, is a promising venue of investigation, because it tells you that, to my knowledge, is the first one on this scale that is able to map some procedural characteristics into performances. And, well, I leave it here. I think that we have dissected an important part of the productivity slowdown, which is essentially the number of backward firms that persist and they're not selected out. I finish here.
Thanks a lot, Enrica and Giovanni. And now I'd like to welcome Riita Katila, professor at Stanford University. You didn't come all the way from Italy, but almost as much of a travel from the one side of the bay to the other. So thanks a lot. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bo. Excited to be here. I will keep my comments brief because Greg will also have a discussion after me. So I want to just highlight how much I liked the paper. It was the remote, yes. So thank you for the opportunity. And like I said, I really liked the paper. So a couple of things, a few slides about what I thought was interesting about the paper, the contributions, and then a few slides about dynamic capabilities, which to me, as a strategy scholar, is an important theme of the paper. So, and Greg and I were tasking here so that I go high level, and then Greg will highlight some of the go deeper into some of these issues. So to me, three very important contributions by the team here. First, as you just emphasized, this to me is one of the most comprehensive empirical operationalizations of dynamic capabilities I've seen in a while. Excellent data from Italy, and they really get into not only what organizational practice and capabilities, but they get into their combinations, which is difficult to do. Very neat taxonomy, this tech organizational managerial strategy, which I think more as positioning, and then sort of environmental relations as the third. And then, to me, the most interesting part of the paper is the performance consequences, or maybe relation to performance. And they identify that these complex firms that are able to, they're kind of a triple threat firms. They're able to do tech organizational capabilities really well, or at least they're doing them. And they also use managerial strategy positioning, and they also report relations that they take into account their environmental dependencies and relations. So that's the interesting part of the paper. So there are some of these firms that are complex in terms of how they combine different types of capabilities, and most importantly, they really do well the organizational capabilities, and there are very few of them. So that does that has performance consequences. And I just wanted to highlight, I was just in my office taking pictures of my hard copy of the paper, but what I thought was interesting is really the as we hit the pandemic times and there is dynamism in the environment, the pattern that the complex firms, although there are fewer of them, but they really are in the fourth category. They have employment growth and productivity growth. So that's one of the really most interesting parts of the paper. The other part that I thought was interesting, since we're in Silicon Valley, is the idea that, or this split between small and medium versus large firms, and it's a little difficult to see here. But basically, they have the small and medium enterprises here, and these guys, this is their point. These guys really need to get the capability strategy right, because there are huge performance penalties if you just pick the essential capabilities, and there are huge benefits if you're able to do the complex strategy well. So I'm thinking, I don't know in an Italian context whether these are like the small startups, and maybe that's that's why the small medium sized is so important. They to be able to drive the economy, maybe those are the startups, and they need to have the capabilities right. So that was really interesting to me. Okay, so in the interest of time, let me move on. This does remind me a little bit about the activity systems. Nicholas Sigelkov has done qualitative work there, but I think you're really bringing the quantitative element here, which is really interesting. The second big point to me about this, I don't know what happened here on the left. But the second big point I wanted to talk about is dynamic capabilities. So much interesting work in this area. I teach a doctoral seminar on strategy, and I keep track of all of these definitions of dynamic capabilities. We always start with David, and then I invite some of these people. Connie Helfat came 1 year, Marvin Lieberman came 1 year. David, invitation is out. When are you joining? Next year. Thank you. And I have witnesses here. So I got Connie's definition. She confirmed last year. Her definition is still capabilities that help firms change over time. Marvin Lieberman very similarly had a ability to change over time. That's dynamic capabilities. But he was saying there's no empirical measure. And this was when he was visiting, so I think now you are really getting there, you really nailed this, and then I always use this Rebecca Henderson and Coburn 1994 paper, which is in innovation and R&D context, and they say they are measuring competencies, but they also say you can't really measure them because if you measure them, then they can't be a source of competitive advantage. So I think that gets to the idea why these complex capabilities are so important, because it's hard to measure something that's complex. So it probably can be a source of competitive advantage. Okay, so why am I showing this? So if we look at the paper here, I think there are a couple of really interesting elements. So the authors are looking at their data stretches to performance in 2020, which gets us to the pandemic period. So it's a really excellent way to test how our friends have defined dynamic capabilities. David is addressing rapidly changing environments. Connie Helfat help firms change over time, and then ability to really change. So I think just picking this pandemic period is great job. You're putting capabilities into test when you show what matters. Also, you have excellent micro data, which gets to Marvin Lieberman's complaint that there isn't really a way to measure, or we don't have empirical measures. And then finally, Nelson and Rebecca Henderson, Coburn, observation that if something is easy to describe, easy to measure, then inherently less likely. Well, you're saying, look, it's really the complex capabilities and the combinations that matter here. Okay, so that's basically what I had. Just very, I think Greg might be getting into these. I was wondering, are these findings specific to the pandemic, maybe to the Italy? Then I was wondering, we're in the business school, so who in the organization is responsible for building these complex capabilities? This was just my curiosity. What are the implications for business education? Because if complex capabilities, interdependent capabilities that track technological, organizational, managerial, and relation, all of them need to come together. Some may be more important than others, but still you need to master all three across the spectrum. So what are the implications, for example, for business education, for managerial education? We need these people who are really interdisciplinary and understand across the three areas. So why don't I just stop there. This is going to be my new go-to article for my doctoral seminar. And I'm going to maybe ditch 1994 and just have you guys instead as a highlight of how to empirically measure dynamic capabilities. So excellent job. Really a pleasure to read the article. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you very much, Riita. Now I'd like to welcome our own Greg Linden from Berkeley Haas. Greg, take it away.
Okay. Let's see, I need a clicker. Thank you. Okay, for those who don't know me, I've been helping David Teece with editing and research for over 10 years, so very immersed in capabilities as a theme. And Riita did a lovely job of talking about the strengths of the paper, and it's unusual to see capabilities raised in the framework of talking about productivity, and David already mentioned the Adler et al. Paper. There's the reference for those who didn't quite catch it. And so what Giovanni and Enrica and their colleagues have done is they've made this fabulous effort at bringing capabilities back into the discussion of productivity, and the fact that they could get data that spanned the pandemic, at least the beginning of it, was tremendous, and that really clarifies some points. So mostly I'm going to be sort of just poking at this thing and asking questions. I found the paper pretty confusing. I'm not a quantitative kind of guy, and I did read the appendices, and thank you for making those available. I was not quite clear on what the numbers, where you show numbers that apply to the 4 taxa of firm types. When you say it's how intensely a firm is characterized by an attribute, I just have a hard time connecting that to something substantive, something I can relate to or talk about. You had this amazing data set, and I would have been asking very targeted questions that would have brought out narrower facts, so a very different approach. The one you did was comprehensive and a very high-level view, and yet I hope you will also have a chance to go into the data set and ask these other types of questions about, well, R&D intensity, how does that affect different strategy profiles? I mean, it's such a rich data set. And also, I guess I wasn't sort of clear on where you were trying to get to in terms of what you wanted to show, but if you define sort of explaining productivity in groups of firms as an end state, then is your method actually superior to doing the more traditional, just run a bunch of regressions on the data kind of method? Just a thought. I'll be talking more about capabilities, but I don't really think of the capability as being an ensemble of organizational behaviors, I guess what you're calling a genotype. That's really sort of an entire organization you're talking about. It's like you lay out the human resources and the R&D and all that. So it was, it put me in mind of this other paper, which is from the 80s. This is a famous model of firms where everything has to hang together. There's no real causal explanation, but it's all in there, and there has to be alignment. And another old paper that got into complementarity was Milgram and Roberts from the 90s, where they're talking about this supermodularity and the whole being more than the sum of its parts. And that seemed like a relevant part of the discussion. I guess I felt like you weren't really able to talk about the parts, so maybe that made it hard to talk about how the parts added up to more than it would appear that they are individually. So, you have these 4 clusters, and you do a good job of describing them qualitatively. And it's interesting, the interdependent cluster being more in the supplier class of firm, that sort of thing. But there is a monotonicity in a lot of the measures of them. And there are points in the paper where you say, well, those first 2 taxa really are pretty similar, and those last 2 taxa are pretty similar. How much would you have lost if you'd just gone to 2 clusters? And, you're talking about dualism, that sort of has a two about it. And, dualism in Italy, I just grabbed a reference from the Bank of Italy about, how the small firms are just this big mass of really not innovative enterprises and kind of holding the economy back in terms of productivity. So, I know this is not news to anybody. So, in terms of management functions, you guys are pretty hard on managers. So that's come up already, and Giovanni mentioned it. And so, but you were very specific about what you see managers as doing. And to me, that list is pretty much just administering a firm, and it leaves out the whole entrepreneurial side, which you've alluded to in your presentation. But when you say that capabilities are more important than the managerial practices, that's really because of how managerial practices were defined for this purpose. Firms are able to implement, is a quote from your paper, and firms don't really implement anything. It's the managers and the workers who do. And when you're talking about combinations of capabilities and alignment within a taxon, it's really the managers who make those decisions. And that, to me, is a management practice. And then moving on to capabilities themselves, the paper says that it's daunting to identify capabilities. And certainly the way you went about it is daunting. But I just grabbed a random SMJ paper looking for a capability empirical study. And you go out and you ask firms, and you guys had data on firms that allowed you to identify capabilities. I'll be getting into specifics, but if you are starting from scratch, you just define the capabilities. So in this sample paper, it was that you needed to have quality control and inventory management in order to be able to put this new kind of system in. And they went out and asked firms. So I don't think capabilities are daunting. They're just time-consuming to figure out. And so in terms of what capabilities I thought the questionnaire really reflected, a lot of it was HR, personnel training, and you had some of those, I think, under the more techno-organizational issues, and, you can slice and dice those different ways. But, when I think of capabilities, it was really like, what's our hiring process, that kind of thing. And you did have a lot of that in the data set. But one thing I note is that a lot of the routine type questions that I'm referring to here, the HR, was in this section 2, and you have that fabulous graph of which sections got the best response rate in the data set. And I don't remember anything in the paper talking about how the non-responses were handled and whether there might be some bias, because a lot of companies were not answering the questions in the survey. So I didn't understand that. And then we come to dynamic capabilities, which again, the paper says that the ordinary and dynamic capabilities line is blurred, which I found a little surprising. Ordinary is really kind of operational, and it's the actual routines, and dynamic is more deciding which routines you need and weeding out when they're no longer functional. So I don't agree that it's blurred. And saying that dynamic capabilities are subject to the discretion of management, they really are the expression of that discretion. So, I would argue that your complex firms, whether they're large or small, have demonstrated some kind of dynamic capability. I mean, all firms have dynamic capabilities. All firms have to do some measure of sensing and seizing and transforming. I mean, that's going on It may be going on badly, but it goes on. And, I think large firms become large and if they're lucky, stay large because they have stronger capabilities in general. And, to say that dynamic capabilities are irrelevant or they're hard to identify, so we're going to pretend they're not there, is not going to help solve Italy's productivity problem, is my argument. I guess when you were running regressions on the data and saying, well, you can distinguish the complexity of a firm from its size and still they're both significant. I was wondering about other control variables that weren't included. And, there was like the R&D intensity self-rating in the questionnaire and things like that. And we know there's a great Bronwyn Hall article about the Italian economy that says that if you're looking at productivity, R&D and particularly the information technology investments are very significant for productivity in firms. And, that was, I couldn't begin to unpack what you had done to understand if that was reflected or not in your analysis. So that was just frustrating for me. And to conclude, I just had a couple minor things that bugged me. I really tried to answer these for myself, and I couldn't. There's that quote in the paper about a sample of more than 109,000 units representative of a universe of 215,000 firms. I thought that meant that your sample was 109,000, but when you're showing results in a table that does list the number of firms, it's this 211,000. So I don't understand this units versus firms. Is it that you have a sample of 211,000? Okay, then I don't understand what's the sample of more than 109,000 units. It doesn't matter. I just was sharing my confusion here. We can talk about it afterwards. And then, again, in another table, I added up your small, medium, and large total firms, and it didn't add up to the all sample. And I was wondering sort of where the other firms went. Things like that. But that's all. As I say, niggles, you may not know the word. It just means a very minor question or complaint. So just things that are sort of bugging me as I'm working through the article. But thank you. It is a very impressive article. It's beautiful, and it's on such an important topic. And I look forward to pushing the agenda forward. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think what would be good maybe is if Giovanni and Enrica had a chance to respond a little bit, and then we'll see where we are. We can grab some coffee, and then we can have a chat over coffee, or is that good? Or do we need a mandatory mingle? Is there a mandatory? Let's let you guys respond. I think that would be the best. Please.
You begin?
Yes, so thank you so much for both comments, and really very appreciated. And I just take some of the questions related to the methodological part. So let me just start with your first issue. Why did you start with this, let's say, from general to specific? Why just you don't choose one question, and then if you choose many, how did you, let's say, decide which one to pick? So the understanding that we had was starting from complementarity. So we really ruled out the idea of starting just from one question. But then what you do in this type of analysis is that you start from a bigger set, and then you see if you have overlapping information that are coming from variables that are very much related. So when you decide the final set of questions, so we started with more than 40, and then you do some, let's say, dimensionality reduction, and you just maintain those that provide you information that is not repeated. So let's say the identification of the questions was done by means of basically methodologies that allow you to factorize the data structure. So there are information in the paper. There is a test that tells you how much the data set can be factorized, and we were testing the factorability of the set. It means if it is factorizable, it means that all the information retained is relevant. We were above the 80% that is the threshold of the KMO test, so we deem appropriate the procedure. The clustering, why 2 and not 4? Again, this was the result of a test done basically by means of the so-called elbow method. That is a method that tell you how many clusters you want to retain. So in principle, we can keep 2 and just aggregate them. This depends on how much you want to, let's say, be strict vis-a-vis a statistical procedure, or you want to, let's say, merge the information. In terms of where is R&D, this was a recurrent, I think, motive in your discussion. Well, actually, we didn't use proxy of R&D because we were covering an entire section of the questionnaire related to technology. So the idea was to have as a set of covariates that is quite large, as you can see in the paper. Now I don't list all of them, but the set of covariates include, for example, tenureship of the employee, include you have information on profitability, you have information in terms of participation, you have tenure, you have exporting activity, you have participation to domestic group, you have controls in terms of geography, and so I would say a bunch of controls, and also in terms of the explanatory power, given the heterogeneity of the structure of the data set, if you look at the R-square, I would say that it's not, let's say, very low. So we were quite satisfied in terms of the structure of information that we were able to provide. And clearly, I agree that there might be co-foundings, but the idea was trying to use as much as possible controls that were not overlapping with the information contained into the survey. Final, related to the mismatch in terms of the data, this is because the number of people that let's say, the number of firms that actually were addressing, that were replying, those were like a bunch of 100. Then you have reporting coefficient. So you have so it means that one firm does not count as one firm because you have a coefficient of sampling, okay, in the way in which those firms are representative of the structure. Those are coefficients that the statistical office provide that tells you how much is the weight of that reply. So this is actually the mismatch between the two numbers. Then I think I'll stop here and we can go further with other, with other details afterwards. Otherwise, I take too much time. I don't know if Giovanni want to address the dynamic versus static. On the dynamic versus static, I can just say one thing, and on the where are the managers. Dynamic versus static, clearly it would be very interesting, but we just were observing one way at that time. So now we are having the possibility to look at another wave, and this would be really interesting to see how much there is persistence and how much there is static structure. And where are the managers and where are, let's say, the structure inside the firms? This we are not able to locate. So we cannot do the modularity thing that you were, the modularity approach. I stop, really. Giovanni?
No, the only dynamic versus static, clearly they are overlapping because complex firms are characterized, especially complex, all the firms, but especially complex firms are characterized also by procedure to change. So this is part of the dynamic capabilities. Doing R&D, searching, introducing new products. So it is true that the complex, especially the complex firms, are those that entail dynamic capabilities. And in fact, part of the question capture precisely that. So we don't want to stress too much the difference between static and dynamics. What is interesting is that these are sort of birthmark or identifier of the firms that seem to be relatively invariant by looking also at the second wave of the questionnaire. So those that are good tend to remain good, and those that are bad tend to remain bad. Of course, a definite answer will come in 10 years' time when we'll have 3 waves or 4 waves of the questionnaire. Then there is the big question, I mean, what is the degree of discretionality of the manager themselves? I mean, bring the best manager of the world to run an essential bad company. What can he or she do about that? Isn't she constrained by the capabilities that finds there? And if she wants to transform it, yes, can do it, but it will take a long time and probably with a relatively high risk of failure. And the circumstantial evidence is that at the distance of 5 years, the second wave, distance of 5 years, cluster remain largely invariant, despite a major shock that is the pandemic.
All right, everyone, if you could grab a seat, we're going to go for a few more minutes to answer some questions, and then we'll have Brian come up and talk about technology evolution. So the first question is Dick Nelson. Here you go. I can use that.
Mine is my comments are in the form of an observation, as contrasted with the question. As I have not had a chance to read the paper that was the subject of discussion, but both in terms of the presentation and in terms of the discussion, the image I get is of a collection of firms sitting there all by themselves, competing with each other in one way or another, as contrasted with a view of firms operating in a field where there is a considerable amount of interaction and a large number of different kinds of institutions that are involved, which affect very, very strongly the environment within which they are operating, and the chances and the opportunities that are seen for advancing the technology further. I think I've had a couple of conversations with you, David, about this, and you've pushed a bit in that direction. But I most certainly would like to see the work focused on organizational capabilities, a little bit less focused totally on individual standalone organizations, and recognize the broad body of institutions and knowledge that is out there. That include, obviously, other firms. If Eric von Hippel were here, he would say, for goodness sakes, you really need to look at the pattern of interaction between the community of users and the community of suppliers of different types of technologies. There's the upstream connections that are extremely important. There are professional societies. Again, I think some of Eric's earlier work of technical people from different firms coming together in conferences and essentially talking with each other regarding what they are doing and what their companies are doing with various barriers to the communication going on, but a considerable amount of open knowledge there. So I'd like to see the organizational capabilities work embedded much more richly in the innovation systems work, which recognizes this broader community of actors and the fact that there is an awful lot of communication and information out there that is generally shared. Indeed, the question of what kind of information, what kind of knowledge is shared and open to the collectivity, and what kind of information and capability is in fact private, and how it is kept private is a fundamental issue.
Or maybe we take, yeah.
Thanks, Dick. Great. Brian?
Yeah, I'm kind of outside of this particular kind of discussion area, although I think about innovation a lot. And I was really struck by the quote that you can't understand it if you can't measure it, right? And Giovanni said that productivity is a tautology. I think it's worse than that. It's actually nothing. It reminds me of, I work in another area, commodity markets. There's this thing called convenience yield, which really puzzled people for a long while. And then they defined convenience yield in a way that they define how much oil is in a tanker. And the way you define how much oil is in a tanker is you tell people how much the ullage is. Does anybody know what the ullage is of a tanker? It's the part that isn't oil, it's the empty part, right? Well, convenience yield is the part you can't explain with futures prices, and now you have a theory. So now you've explained convenience yield because that's what it is. And productivity is done in more or less the same way. It's what we can't explain, right? But with respect to this talk, and so I'm very sympathetic with the enterprise here because it's so hard, because we don't really know what it is we're trying to describe. But I have a question about what is being measured. And the productivity measurements that I saw were mostly, I think, output per unit of labour, output over turnover, and I think there was another one too. But you talk about high complexity firms having higher wages and being more flexible, etc. But the higher wages probably come with higher capital intensity, because my friends who work in empirical trade have found out that capital-intensive organisations tend to have much higher wages and higher skill levels, and so high skills and capital are complementary. And I didn't see actually direct measures of return on capital, though I might have missed it. There was something about productivity. But if you don't know the capital intensity, then you don't know the part that's missing that you're trying to think about. If you're only talking about labour intensity, then you're not really getting even the difference between inputs and outputs right. But I just might have missed it in the presentation, but I didn't see that. And just another small comment was somebody mentioned in search of excellence. I thought they were making a joke, because in search of excellence, I remember much earlier in my career being very impressed that this guy could explain, which were the very best and most efficient firms with the greatest dynamism and that. And 6 years later or so, it didn't look so good because I think they'd all gone bankrupt. So what we think we know at a certain point, we have to be very humble about, because this is so hard.
Thanks, Brian. One more question? Yeah, one more.
So I really like how you frame the benefits of complexity in terms of robustness and readiness. I think it's interesting to think about that in terms of something like a Penrosian reserve. But I had sort of two questions that kind of go beyond what you guys are writing about in the paper. The first was, is it absolute complexity or relative complexity to like industry peers for what we should really be focusing on? And then the second thing was related to, if you think back from like maybe the 90s, we had normative pressures to focus on core capabilities of the corporation and simple rules in terms of management. And I'm wondering, to what degree does complexity represent like an alternative, normative focus for how we should think about, what firms should be pursuing?
Enrica and Giovanni?
Yes. Dick first. I mean, I totally agree with Dick's observation. What is impressive is that despite firms nested into collective networks of information, knowledge firms, other firms, institutions, they maintain their own identity that feeds upon itself, in a sense. I mean, history counts a lot, seems. And the birthmark of the firm is there to stay. So I think that Dick's observation and our paper are not inconsistent at all. I mean, on productivity, we use labor productivity because we vaguely know what it is. Total factor productivity is something that does not exist. I mean, is a figment of economist imagination. I mean, it's like asking if you eat a good cake, what is the contribution to the goodness of the cake, of sugar, of the egg, of flour, of butter. I mean, in a world of complementarity, does not make sense to have a production function of degree 1, I mean, which implies essential substitution and not complementarity. We find, in any case, that these differences between, say, essential and complexity and complex form also within the same sectors. So you can expect that the capital intensity is the same. It is roughly the same. I mean, when you check capital output ratios and how they correlate with labor productivity, basically the correlation is 0. So it is true that capital output ratio differ a bit even within the same industry, but there is no correlation with labor productivity. Essentially, the intuition is that if you are more efficient in using labor, most often you're more efficient also in using capital. So you don't have anything like a smooth isoquant. This is the short answer to a complex question, which has got to do with the fact that production functions basically don't exist. Of course, you need inputs to make output, but the functional form of the production function is a figment of economist imagination. I mean, absolute versus relative competitiveness. The way we measure it tend to be absolute. Because it says, I don't know if Marika agrees, it says that there is the complementarity among many trades. And it's not comparative with other firms that have got less trades, but are the complementary co-occurrence of several things. Is complexity normative? In a sense, yes. I mean, you want to have firms that have these ingredients like innovative orientation, training of the workforce, use of sophisticated software, etc., etc. So yes, then it's got also a normative aspect.
Just very briefly, on the question of capital, let's say capital productivity, yes, I mean, I tend to agree with what Giovanni just said. We have sectoral controls, and in general, let's say the intensity of capital use is very much explained by sectoral heterogeneity, and what are we measuring is not gross output, is value added. So it's value added over unit of labor. And the issue of the relationship between wages and capital intensity, this is something that, I mean, if you look at the controls that we use, we have a bunch of controls in terms of human capital. So if you think about the relationship between wages and capital, I would much more think about the relationship between human capital and wages. So we have schooling, we have tenure, we have education level information, and yes, level of intensity. I don't know if we take, let's say, petrochemical plant, he has a high level of intensity of capital. Maybe it's not really reflected into wages. And absolute relative, I tend to agree with Giovanni. It's really absolute in our setting. It doesn't mean. I mean, it's. The fact is that, and it's also related to the question raised by Dick before, we are just observing a given landscape, right? So we don't have, in this setting, let's say, inflow and outflows of firms. So we are looking at a continuing sample. So in this respect, it's absolute vis-a-vis themselves, right? But it might be also interesting to see if you have changing landscape, how does it change? So thank you for the question.
We have to go on, but sorry, Asta. Thanks a lot to Monica and Giovanni and to Riita and Greg for all the questions. Now I'd like to welcome Brian Arthur. He's going to give a keynote. We're going to switch over to technology evolution in the economy. I think everyone knows that Brian was one of the persons putting forward a theory on increasing returns and working with complexity economics and now technology evolution. But Brian is also an alum of Berkeley, so most importantly, welcome home.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Bo. And Berkeley's my alma mater, and I don't think I've given a talk here for maybe several decades, so I am indeed glad to be invited here and glad to be back. I'm also very glad to see Giovanni, my old friend, and Dick Nelson, who I haven't seen for a few decades. And glad to see you're both doing very well and sharp as can be. And I'm glad to see some new friends that I'm making in Haas and DCI in general. If you ask the question, how does the economy produce technologies or give rise to technologies, it's not that hard to answer. It has to do with incentives, it has to do with perception of needs, it might have to do with engineers and so on. But I want to ask here the reverse question, not how the economy produces technologies, which not that hard to answer, as I say, but how does technology produce the economy? I should warn you in advance that this doesn't have to do much with the productivity puzzle, though perhaps it does, and perhaps you can enlighten me at the end. So I got permission from Bo. I said, suppose I don't want to talk about that puzzle. which I assign to people like Bob Solow or Robert Gordon. It's not my area, and I think we've just had an excellent paper on that. Anyway, what I want to talk about is my own take on how technology generates an economy. And this will be more in it certainly won't be in an econometric vein, it won't be using statistics or anything, but more in the domain of thought. In 1957, August 1957, Bob Solow produced a now famous paper where he managed to show that about 80% of economic growth came out of somewhere that wasn't identified as capital changes or labor factor changes. It just sort of appeared kind of like dark matter. He conjectured in that paper, I read it again recently, that this was due to what he christened technical change. It's not a very good phrase. I would have said technological change. But somehow, vaguely, it had to do with technology. And I don't think anybody's argued very seriously against that. I think it was good insight at the time. I think very likely it's true. Although there'd be a lot of ifs and ands and buts and relative observations on this. But it brought to mind a metaphor. So if you have a certain amount of growth, new parts of the economy, they're coming into being by somehow technology bringing them into being. And it reminded me of a geological metaphor that came into my mind. There are parts of the world, Iceland is one, the Hawaiian Islands are another, where new land has just bubbled up. Magma somehow underneath the Earth's crust bubbles up, overflows, there are volcanoes, and as a result you get whole new islands, perhaps all of Iceland, certainly all of the Hawaiian Islands, and some geologists might even say significant amounts of land, possibly even continents, I don't know. But somehow new land is bubbling up from underneath the ocean or underneath what already exists as land. I began to wonder if that's true for the economy. If it bubbles up, where does it bubble up? Possibly in Santa Clara County, where I live, Silicon Valley. Possibly, as a Berkeley alum, I'd like to think it bubbles up in Alameda County as well. Or in parts of the world like Austin, Texas, or even parts of Europe. So possibly we have the bubbling up of the economy, at least by analogy or metaphor. If that's the case, how does that work? And I began to think about this and realize that the standard definition of the economy, the kind of thing you read in Hal Varian's intermediate textbook. I was a co-student with Hal in Evans Hall and at classes here a few years ago. But his textbook, like most other textbooks in economics, starts out, assume there are K firms, assume there are T numbers of technologies, assume there are N industries, assume this, assume there are prices for this, assume that. And I would cynically point out that this is all very fine if you want to teach equilibrium economics, where not that much happens, and you can have the players on the stage fixed in numbers and not really doing anything much except somehow growing, getting bigger or getting smaller. It doesn't do for the question I'm asking. So the definition of the economy I want to propose, at least for this discussion, is one where I would say the economy, what does an economy consist of? I would put forward it consists of the arrangements we make and the actions we take to fulfill our needs as human beings. Now, this would encompass primitive economies, it would encompass ancient economies, or ones of nomads on the steppes, or very modern economies, such as we have. And those arrangements, which I want to focus on, might include the legal system. So you might have institutions in there, you might have the stock market in there, you might have markets in there. Those are all arrangements. You might have arrangements for shipping and arrangements for trading. But I want to, because this is a finite time session, I want to sort of do away with institutional changes and say that's a separate discussion, and just concentrate on what we would call here technologies. I don't necessarily mean the production of goods. I'm talking about technologies, actual engineering technologies, steam engines, computers, large language models, algorithms, whatever you want to call them. The arrangements by which we attempt to satisfy our needs. And I'm not saying there's n numbers of those. I used to wonder, I wrote a book about technology, and I wondered how many technologies might there be. Probably a few hundred. Actually, maybe a few thousand. Actually, maybe. I looked up the number of medical procedure technologies that the medical profession in New York lists as separate and unique. 64,000 for medical procedures. So I'm not going to attempt to say, let there be n technologies. I'm just saying, let there be multiple arrangements by which we try to satisfy our needs. So, and I'm sticking mostly with technologies in this discussion. First thing I want to say is that technologies come in clusters. Giovanni wrote a lot about this earlier, technological paradigms, and very memorably, technological trajectories, because these technologies are not necessarily static. They're not just a collection of 10 different or 100,000 different variations. They're changing, and they're developing, and they're going somewhere, and that somewhere depends, of course, on the context they're evolving in. And evolution is very much part of this story. But what I want to draw your attention to is that the technology of the day sets up the economy of the day. So let me take a look at that. Here's an economy. You might recognize the picture, if you like. It's Constable, 1819, and this is the English economy. And there are technologies. Here's a guy with a horn. Here are horses and carts. There's a boat here. There's agricultural technology over there. There's houses, farms, the whole sort of bucolic setup. 1819 was the year in which Queen Victoria was born. And that technology, I wouldn't say it was beset, a lot of it still was around maybe 50 or 100 years later. But major parts of England experienced novel technologies coming along, sets of technologies or clusters to do with textile machinery, powered by steam engines, maybe at first powered by water power, but eventually powered by steam engines. And 40 years later, a lot of the English economy looked quite different. And I don't know where this is. Could be Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, I don't know. And in fact, I'm old enough to remember when my home city, which is Belfast, part of the UK still, looked like this. We're beyond that now, but this took about 40 to 50 years of Queen Victoria's life. I don't think she had much to do with this. Dickens very memorably wrote about this transformation or its results, and so did Karl Marx and Engels and others. So the point I want to make here is the technology of the day, or the cluster of technologies, is taking you from this to this. And we can ask, how does this happen? Now, if you're a very pragmatic person, which I'm not, you can just, well, doesn't it just happen? I mean, you can do these things, I mean, surely, and you get there eventually, and it's unavoidable. But I want to look at some more details of how this happens. The first question you might ask in this is, where do novel technologies come from? Where do novel textile technologies come from? Where do the spinning jenny, for example? Where do better or improved or novel steam engines come from in the 1760s, 1770s? So you could say, where do inventions come from? I wrote about this in a paper in Research Policy, and it was a really wonderful thing to investigate because my method was to look at the research notebooks of people who actually had invented major and significant technologies. And I did this for several years. My background's in engineering, so I can't say I was an economist who was sort of bumbled into this and didn't know much about it. But I began to see very similar things. The textbooks on invention that I read were very plausible. The conditions have to be right, the risk-taking has to be right, there has to be some capital there has to be this and that. It's kind of like saying, how do flowers grow? Well, you need a pot, you need suitable soil, you need some moisture, you need this and that, and then flowers appear. No, they don't. They have to germinate first. And when it comes to technologies germinating, the literature, all the literature that I read, and some of it was pretty good, all sort of got hung up. And step 3, something very creative happens. And that very creative thing was sort of assigned to people are geniuses. They're somehow incredibly smart. Where does the polymerase chain reaction come from? Actually, that was cooked up over here on Highway 1, just north of San Francisco by Kary Mullis, around about 1980 or so. Is he a genius? I don't want to hypothesize that. He did get a Nobel for his pains. And I read, that was one of the technologies I investigated in depth, the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, that copies molecules. But I wanted to get beyond, and then something very creative happens. It's not quite that. All technologies, all the ones I know of, and I'm not making an empirical claim here, I could back it up theoretically. All technologies are put together, or combined, or assembled from what's already there. In fact, when you invent a technology, you're not just sitting there somehow levitating vaguely and then calling in genies from bottles or something and say, give me this brilliant solution, and then I'll rush it to the lab and try it out. The only thing I saw, by the way, rushing to the lab was I read this first-hand account of James Watt seeing how to greatly improve the steam engine. And I was delighted to see it. It happened on a Sunday. And so James Watt was a very strong practicing Presbyterian. He sees how to make a new steam engine. He's convinced this will work much better. It'll be much more efficient thermodynamically than the previous steam engine. But it's a Sunday. He can't get to his workshop because he'd be breaking the law of the Sabbath, and it nearly kills him to have to wait a day to get into his workshop, remachine the whole thing. Of course, it did work. So occasionally there are things like that sort of pressure of creativity. But notice here, this is true in general. Novel technologies is a very early train. Looking at this, I would say probably about 1831, because we have a locomotive, it has to be after 1829. But we still have coaches that already existed on wheels, early stuff, about 1832, 1831, I would reckon. Novel technologies are made by putting together already existing technologies. Same in mathematics. Novel theorems are proved, or novel results are got by putting together structures that already exist. This is true in all of human endeavors. They're not made by taking things that didn't exist, although you could conjecture if something did exist, maybe I could use that. Let's bring that into being. But fundamentally, they're created from technologies or structures that already exist. All of these structures, coaches, this one looks to be wood-fired. There are cranks, there are wheels, there are boilers, there are chimneys. All those technologies already existed. So fundamentally, invention is problem solving. How do I satisfy a need for either transporting people or transporting goods smoothly? I can put them on rails, just as people did in mining. You get a wagon, you put it in some sort of planking or rails, cuts down the friction enormously, and things can roll along beautifully. And all of this works. How do I do that in a more general way? So invention is a form of problem solving. One of the things I did was I looked up the lab books of Gary Starkweather at Xerox PARC, where I actually still work. It's a techie company in Silicon Valley, and they invented the laser printer. About that time, Starkweather and his friends were wondering, this would have been about 1970, 71, how do you get a computer to print a general image? If you remember computers in those days, some of you would, they're sort of big line-type printing machines, like giant typewriters, and those clanked out. How do you get a computer to print a general image, such as a photograph or an architectural drawing? Starkweather's, he had several ideas, looking for a principle, and he said, okay, maybe one of the ideas, he has about 4 or 5 different ideas, maybe you could burn it on paper, thermally the image, and then that could be sensed via some sort of cathode ray tube. But the promising idea he came up with was maybe we could use a computer to shine a light, have to be highly focused, therefore laser light, on a Xerox drum. Now, he was working in Xerox PARC. Finding a Xerox drum was not that hard. So he could paint the image on a Xerox drum. just crank the Xerox drum and you get multiple copies out. The rest was xerography. So what Starkweather managed to do, what you find in general is that you're not solving one problem, but that one problem brings up sub-problems. And in Gary Starkweather's case, he reckoned that if he wanted the laser to create bits that's on and off for light and dark, he would have to scan that laser and be able to switch it on and off 50 million times, or 50 megahertz, 50 million times a second. That's a sub-problem. So how do you solve that? He did that via piezoelectronics. Anyway, point is that invention in this case is very much a matter of problem solving, and it's not just one problem, but you go down several layers. Is that genius? Well, it struck me that suppose my car's in the shop, suppose I live in Palo Alto, wherever that is. I think it's somewhere we don't talk about here. Suppose I live in Palo Alto, and suppose my car's in the shop and I need to get to work in San Francisco. How am I going to do that? Typically, I might go through 5 or 6 different possibilities. Oh, I could call my friends and maybe get a ride in. But hang on, they don't quite go at times that would work for me. Maybe I could take Caltrain, so go to the train station, get off in San Francisco and maybe get an Uber or something to where I do work. But notice what I'm doing is trying to think of a principle and then ways to put together existing technologies. And I might finally say, yeah, that train idea is good, but how do I get to the station locally because I don't have my car? Oh, well, I'll get my spouse to drop me off at the train station if they will comply. If they can't, then there'll be other sub-problems to solve. The point I want to make here is we solve problems like that routinely, and we do this sort of problem every day. We don't call it invention. We don't call it genius. We are simply saying, I have a need. I want to put together various parts of things that will work to satisfy that need. And because all of these operations are familiar to me, Caltrain and getting a ride to the local station, we don't regard that as genius or anything. But it's not different to what Kary Mullis over in Highway 1 was doing when he thought up the polymerase chain reaction. And the main difference is that he was working with what we would regard as rather arcane operations in molecular biology. But he commented later, he said, someone said, what's your main feeling now about the insight you had that afternoon? His main insight was that it was so easy. He was amazed nobody else had thought of it. First, you only have to hybridize this part of the DNA, then et cetera, et cetera. Because it's arcane, we tend to think of this as genius. So it's not a huge mystery as to how novel technologies are created. I want to move on to say, okay, what happens from there? Suppose there are new technologies or new clusters of technology. What does that do? Well, every new technology creates an opportunity for business, or it creates something that possibly, a new possibility for business. Think in the 1960s and early 70s of data processing coming along, computer technology in that. So the computer sits there. That's a vague opportunity for businesses. Can we computerize? How would we use data processing? Nowadays, we have other technologies. The blockchain is an opportunity. How would we use blockchain in business? How would we use LLMs or generative AI? That's a huge opportunity possibly sitting there. How would we use gene editing if I'm in a medical field, a Berkeley technology, CRISPR? These are clusters of technologies. They're not single technologies. They come in parts. How would we use that? And in bringing those into business, we would call that, loosely speaking, innovation. I think the distinction is invention, innovation, dispersion. That goes back to Schumpeter, this sort of language. How would we actually bring a novel set of technologies into business? How does innovation work? Well, you're really asking how businesses react. The story when I was studying here at Berkeley was that businesses adopt. They're sort of standing there and say, okay, we have blockchain. Am I going to adopt blockchain or not? Oh, okay, I will. Or maybe they're a little bit slow and say, oh, I don't know how this is going to work out. And let a few other people adopt this technology. I don't like this whole idea of adoption. I don't think it works quite like that. I'd prefer to say that businesses, that a novel set of technologies comes along. Think of, again, generative AI comes along. That sits in front of businesses and they encounter that technology. They sort of stare at it and say, what are we going to do about this huge opportunity? How am I going to react to this? So they encounter it just like you would encounter something in your life. If you've ever been skiing, you might have encountered KT22, which I never mastered up in what was then called Squaw Valley. You encounter and then you think. And I want to say, and this applies to dynamic capabilities, it's in that encounter that you have sensing and seizing and what was the next thing? Transforming. That is not the only source of dynamic capabilities, but it's one of the major sources. Businesses say, oh my God, there's these new opportunities out there. I can sense that. How are we going to use it? How are we going to seize it, etc.? Okay, well, the point I want to make here is that there is a recognizable pattern by which when businesses encounter something, that they use that and bring it into what they're doing. It's not quite that they adopt it. It's more that businesses, as several people pointed out already this afternoon, businesses have usually have sets of operations, sets of activities. These technologies themselves have sets of offerings or sets of functionalities. And some of the activities and some of those functionalities come together and click together, and they give you something very new and different. Let me give you one illustration. Imagine AI comes along, and I'm either a retail bank or a commercial bank. I have a portfolio of activities that I need to do. I need to be able to validate people who are online or people who come in, oh, you're so-and-so. I know you are such and such, I've validated that. You need to be able to do compliance. If I offer you such and such, is that legal? Is that contractually recognized? I need to be able to scan documents and previous contracts. I need to be able to manage cash and push it from one account very quickly and intelligently into other accounts. I need to issue loans. I need to set up escrow arrangements. These are all the operations or functions that are done sometimes by retail banks or in a more complicated way by commercial banks. Some of the offerings from AI fit very well. Oh, yeah, somebody gets online or some voice online. Hi, this is me. I want to set up a mortgage. Well, the AI is there to set up validation. So via voice recognition, fingerprint recognition, facial recognition, whatever it would be. Similarly, parts of AI can say, I want to give you an alert if these cash balances are trending in that direction, pop up a warning signal. So what happens in the area of innovation or in this encounter is that the technology itself, parts of the technology, and parts of what the business itself is previously doing come together. And some of the functions of the business may be replaced by some functionality in the technology. The new technology may wipe out other parts of our operations in the business entirely. It may invent new things the business has not been able to do. And the people who do this are exercising, to a very high degree, dynamic capabilities. They're not just sitting there and saying, okay, well, you know, it's routine that Wells Fargo 3 weeks ago introduced such and such, we need to do it over here. A certain amount of that goes on. But an awful lot of that is just sitting around and saying, okay, we want to stay ahead of the curve here. I remember I was advising a bank, must have been 7 or 8 years ago, before all the fuss about OpenAI came along. It was very much a question of how are we going to get into this game. Some people, entrepreneurs, were coming in from the technological side. We know how to do all this technology. All we need to do is pick up the banking side. And so their vision was what we would now call fintech, financial technology. Other banks were coming in and say, well, we have the resources, we have the deposits, we have the financial base, hugely to billions of dollars. How are we going to get the technology to work? And there's a pirouette and a dance and a pas de deux between the technology and between the commercial apparatus for all of this to work. It takes a lot of time. It's very individual. It's not something can be rushed. And this happens historically too. Paul David, who was a colleague of mine at Stanford, wrote a really nice paper years ago where he was talking about electric motors being brought in very slowly. Electric motors came available to the textile business around 1880. They were good ones. They were driven at the time by steam engines, really clunky technology. But you could put an electric motor separately with each textile machine. It took 40 years for that combination to come about, machine, electric motor. The reason was that the electricians didn't know anything much about architecting textile companies. Textile architects knew nothing about electrical machinery. So it took a long time for those two types of functionalities to marry together and to make something new and something very different work. The point I want to make here is, I hope, simple But I think it's a profound point. Not that I'm being profound, it's profound in that it really matters. Note that what's happened, let's say textile machinery is now powered by electric motors. Let's say that banking operations are partly taken over internally by some types of AI working with some operations and differentially. Structural change has arrived. The business is not working as before, adopting AI and now being different. The business has subtly changed, and it's changed from within. So structural change in this picture comes from within. It doesn't land on top of you and then you either adopt or you don't adopt. It has to work its way in. It has to be architected in. It has to be thought in. And people have to take risks early on and think about in terms of dynamic capabilities. This is how it's going to work. Here's my banking slide that I forgot to show you. That is bank. Okay, we'll move on. I want to widen, this to finish with, I want to widen the scope of what I'm talking about here and back off a bit. So I've just been talking about individual firms or companies that are producing. They change structurally from within. It takes imagination. It takes risk-taking. It takes know-how. And it takes time. Now I want to back off and say, all right, move out again, a new technology comes in. How does that affect the entire economy? And I call this an algorithm. It's a set of procedures or steps. I don't mean it's a computational algorithm. This is algorithmic thinking as opposed to whatever differential equations or something. Let's say a new technology comes in. Let's say it's the transistor, shows up around 1950 or so, Bell Labs, and it replaces existing technologies. In this case, it would start to replace vacuum tube technologies. Step 2, and some of these steps are in parallel, so it's not 1, 2, 3. These things might be happening simultaneously. The novel technology calls forth further technologies. What does that mean? Well, if the transistor shows up, immediately there's a call for, how can we produce transistors? What sort of silicon technologies or germanium technologies do we need? How would those work? How can we use those at a manufacturing level? In fact, how do we organize these better? One of the technologies that the transistor called forth was integrated circuits. Texas Instruments and other companies brought that in around 1960. So it took about 10 years. But further technologies were called forth. It becomes a building block for yet more technologies. Transistor appears. Oh, okay, we can have 3 transistors and have a simple radio circuit. We can have 3 million transistors. We can have 3 billion transistors, or whatever it is, in a modern computer, all doing very sophisticated things. I think it was von Humboldt talked about language as the infinite use of finite means. You just finite number of words, you can put those together in an infinite number of ways. Finite number of transistors or finite, you can keep putting together in myriad ways, and that brings you a complete electronic revolution. And of course, as all of this is happening, the overall economy, if I can get the overall economy meaning prices and quantities are adjusting apace. So is society, and so are institutions. By the way, I'm a big fan of the work of Carlota Perez in this area of how does the economy and society adjust to these surges and clusters of novel technologies come along. What I want to point out here is something I find interesting from a technological or a computational point of view. A novel technology comes along. Note that in step 2 and step 3, the novel technology is calling forth yet more technologies. And in step 3, it becomes a building block for use in yet more technologies. So if this were a computational algorithm, you'd say it's recursive. The algorithm is calling itself. A novel technology comes, some of the steps are calling for further novel technologies, which would start the algorithm again and in parallel. And is setting up as a building block for yet further technologies that in their time will call for yet further technologies. So this whole thing is a recursive set, or recursive meaning calling itself, technologies creating technologies, and calling for further technologies in a way that doesn't stop. Let me summarize what I think is some of the main points that come out of this. It's not as if there's a punchline to this. I'm trying to set forth how an economy is created from individual technologies, how individual technologies themselves are created, and how those individual technologies are encountered by business, and business itself changes. So I would say this as the first point I'm making up here. The economy is forming from its technologies, but those technologies themselves are coming about from economic need. So the economy itself, if you think, is setting up opportunity niches or needs for further technologies. Those further technologies transform the economy at a very deep level, and that sets up different and further needs for technologies that further transform the economy. So the economy is, missed it here. The economy is, see, technology, I may be an engineer, but anyway, the economy is forming itself from the economy itself. Systems like that, technically, was Varela and Maturana called this, two Chilean philosophers, they called this sort of setup autopoietic, in Greek meaning self-creating. So the economy is creating itself out of itself. It then sits there as it is now and recreates itself out of itself. Second point I want to make is that all of this is absolutely and essentially and forever in non-equilibrium. The moment you get if I can sense a new disease, say in 1860 or something, call it tuberculosis, immediately there's a need set up. How do we cure tuberculosis? How do we deal with that? So non-equilibrium is the norm, and it's not just a sort of, oh, well, nothing's static because technology is going to come along and the production functions are going to change, aren't they? And some genius, anyway. No, it's not that. It's more than that. This operates at all scales. So at the industrial scale, the whole banking industry, you can say, yep, that's going to change now that we have generative AI. Don't know quite how it's going to change. I can give you some trajectories along which this is going to happen. I can show you how all of this is going to work. But notice that the changes are operating not just at the industry scale, the incentives for change. The encounter is happening at the firm level. It's not happening at the department level. It's happening at the individual level. And the encounters at each of these levels are quite different. And they're sensed differently at these levels, and they're seized differently at those levels. And at all those levels, all the time, and in parallel, everywhere in the economy that's encountering the possibility of anything new, that's happening all the time. So the entire bleeping economy, the entire bloody economy, whatever you want to call it, is encountering at all levels, in parallel, at all times. Now, I think various people who taught me, like Gerard Debreu and others, good morning, how are you? It's nice to meet you, are probably spinning at this moment. But the encounter here is ongoing. It's alive. This is not something that's highly ordered. It's at all levels, at all scales, at all times. And the economy that results, I would say, is open, meaning not quite sure what will be discovered or needed or acted upon next. So in that sense, it's open, like if you're a grad student here, or even if you're beyond that stage, your life is open. You don't know what's going to happen. You can choose this, choose. The economy is just like that. It's organic in the sense that each layer is building on the layers before. It's the current economy that's setting up these needs or opportunity niches that are calling forth novel technologies that are encountered at all these levels. It's uncertain, which is something that David's dealt with a lot. Uncertainty meaning Pache business school teachings. You cannot put risks or assign probabilities to what's going to happen. Of course you can in practice, but do they really mean anything? You don't know what is going to happen next. In 1937, Keynes took up the point of uncertainty, already been around with Frank Knight, and he says about the prospects for a European war within 3 years, we simply don't know. So you get fundamental uncertainty out of this, and never at rest. I couldn't resist putting that phrase in there. The phrase, amazingly enough, is Isaac Newton's, never at rest, with a big sort of squiggle for the S in rest. This thing that's unleashed never settles down. There's no final equilibrium or final outcome it's all heading towards. It's completely open. And there's no part of it, in principle, in my opinion, not agriculture, that's at rest. I got a very nice set of citations recently on my technological work. I've forgotten the guy's name, but as an archaeologist, the key guy is American, who deals with the giant pyramid at Giza. And apparently that was not at all at rest. The technology was changing all the time, and was changing significantly, and it was open, organic, and uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I know it's my fault for running over a little bit, but since we have such a great group of people here, I know this is just not an ordinary Thursday evening, right? Maybe at Berkeley. Some questions for Brian. David.
Brian, we're 50 yards from Evans Hall, and if you gave the presentation over there, half the room would be empty by now. But you're in the Haas School, and in fact, we agree, I think, with most everything, if not everything, that you've said. And it was a brilliant presentation. I felt like this was one of the best TED Talks I'd ever heard. And of course, it's consistent with Giovanni and Richard's approach.
Very much.
So we've got the hard task here in business schools of trying to figure out what does this mean for management, and also what does it mean for public policy. The guys next door have the same challenge, but they're not up to it. We're willing to give it a try. So let's just take one area, which is competition policy, and then I'll talk about technology policy. A couple of things that come out of this is that, and this is very consistent with what Dick was saying earlier today, is what goes on in the marketplace, of course, is a function of everything that went before and a lot of stuff that's going on outside the marketplace. And of course, in antitrust analysis, the first step in most cases is let's define a relevant market. So the economists want to put boundaries around the market, and they're looking just purely at product market. They're not looking at institutions. They're not looking at nothing else. They're not looking at capabilities, and then they go forward and do their analysis. And it's a simplification that is clearly wrong. And, in an economy that's open, organic, and uncertain, the number one anchor of antitrust analysis, you kind of tip it upside down. So there's one thing that I thought about. But also in terms of evaluating who are potential competitors, or what are the capabilities of individual firms to compete. If there's a merger, are you taking out a firm that's really going to make a difference or not? How does the framework, or really the foundation, you put forward the foundations of what makes what an economy is. By the way, as you were giving it, I was thinking about Herbert Simon's comment, when you look from space down at Earth, you don't see markets, you see institutions, you see firms, and your vista is sort of similar. You see technologies actually first. Mm-hmm. So you would modify Simon's famous comment to say, no, actually what you see first, and I love the Constable picture and so forth. I never thought of it in those. I'm a great fan of Constable, and I thought, you're right. How would I miss all of that? This is really a snapshot of a time, and it actually displays all those technologies. And then you had the steam train pulling what was close to a stagecoach, showing how we constantly modify things. So there were just brilliant graphics to drive your point home. But how do we get this into policy? Other than it brings you humility. I mean, and this is what ticks me off with a lot of my colleagues in economics. They're very clear they got the right answer. And once you go down this road, you're a lot more humble as an economist. But what are the main insights for policy that come from this? If you can get it down to just one or two things, whether it's competition policy or technology policy, that you would like us to take away and work on with respect to our research agendas for the future, because none of us have got anything to do here, and we're really open to new ideas.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to say first is I think you mentioned context and other firms. I sort of skated by that very quickly, but I'd like to take up Dick's point earlier that you were saying with Giovanni's presentation. These firms are not individual and separate and unique. They're in an ecology of other firms. And the same thing goes if you're encountering, I was very much part of this a few years ago in 2018 when, let's just say, a very large worldwide firm was sort of panicking. how are we going to take on AI and change the way we operate? But it was in a context, given that everybody else is going to try and do this, and where do we hire the talent, given that everybody else wants to hire the same talent, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, Dick, that as you pointed out before, the context of other firms and other potential technologies matters a lot. I've given a rather simplified thread here. Second thing, you're asking, so what for policy? Unfortunately, my response is going to be, I don't know. In 3 days, I'll be sitting in a coffee shop somewhere saying, God, I wish I'd been smart and come up with this. But frankly, I don't quite know. I would say that if someone said to me, you've given a talk here, and I used to have an office in Evans Hall, not far away. You've given a talk here. What really was the basis of the talk? I would say, rather than regard the economy as a given set of markets with prices and all interacting, lovely stuff, a la Arrow and Debreu and others, and my hat is off to them. Ken Arrow was one of my mentors for a long time in Stanford, so somebody I hold very dear. I'm not against that. But what instead, if we took the primitives of our arguments, not as markets, goods and prices, but as technologies themselves? And what if those technologies were not all machines? We can call them arrangements, might be how to do insurance policies, things like that. Frankly, I don't know about policy. I think, of course, all the usual problems would come up. Do you subsidize technologies early on? Do you try to spot winners? Do you give incentives? I don't know. But these are questions worth looking into. I think any time there's a shift saying let's regard something not from this angle, but from an angle 30 degrees or 45 degrees different, let's look at the economy as being created by its technologies, brings up a lot of ancillary questions. I wish I could be smarter than that, but oh yes, here's what it means for policy. But it's more in the I do have a book I should possibly show you. But that book is 2009, and I wasn't quite thinking exactly like this. Everything I've said here is implicit in my book, which, Dick, is about how technology, not just what it is, but how it evolves. And it's a tale to tell. But no, I haven't thought about policy implications. And I'm going to deeply regret this within 3 days, I know.
So thank you very much for inspiring presentation. I even extracted some fundamental problems, for my future research. But you were saying that technology is problem solving, right? What about technology problem creation?
Oh, yeah.
Because if you take 3D printing, right? People started to print pasta with 3D printing machines, right? The one piece of pasta is absolutely overpriced in comparison with mom's pasta, at home. And now a lot of people are thinking, researchers are thinking how to reduce the price of 3D printing pasta, right? So it creates a lot of new challenges that you say really technology stimulates the other technology coming. I believe a very similar thing is with generative AI, right?
Yeah.
Now everybody thinks how to make use or how to be fashionable with AI as well. So what about technology as a problem creator and how it really rearrange economy, but also society and human beings?
Sure. That's a really good question, and I would certainly say this, that every technology that I know of, like the steam engine or gasoline engine even, they've been brought forward for very specific purposes to solve certain problems. And just about every major technology I know of has created further problems. Could be social problems, could have to do with global warming. With AI, I'm not a big fan. I've been deeply involved in versions of this for 3 or 4 decades. I'm watching it very closely, but I'm suspicious. I feel, for example, like AI, well, we can boost a lot of what we do. That'd be wonderful. Let's say I'm young and ambitious and I want to climb Mount Everest. And somebody says, oh, okay, no problem, we can get you to the top of Everest. We're going to put in escalators all the way, and that'll get you automatically to the top of Mount Everest. You'll have climbed Mount Everest. That's good, isn't it? No, because that's not the point. What we need as human beings is not just the ability to get something done. We need challenge. We need to be able to achieve as people. We need to be able to sense that it was worthwhile doing. If we've novel technologies, we don't want to say this is creating more nuisance, etc., etc. So I've yet to see a technology that doesn't have a negative side. Perhaps there are such. I can't think of any, and I've spent years researching all that. So it's a very good question. I think what we do need, my real answer to that question is, let's move forward carefully, thoughtfully, tentatively, and consciously, without necessarily thinking, all of this is wonderful. And I think we haven't really learned to do that with technology. We just haven't learned that yet. We haven't had sufficient experience over thousands of years. In this book, I point out that there's 2 forces, I think, at play. When we think about technology, our hopes, if you say, is there hope for mankind? Are we going to live longer? Are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? Our hopes tend to lie in technology, but our trust doesn't. Our trust lies in nature. Is this natural? I can do such and such. Well, how natural is that? I can do, I can do something like CRISPR. So then immediately I'm going, oh, is that natural? And how natural is it? And because we have millions of years of dealing with nature, we're adapted to nature, we know what nature is, we know what we're going to get out, and we have a good relationship with it individually. So these are like 2 tectonic plates colliding. Our hope lies in technology. Our trust lies in nature, and these things are colliding at a fantastic rate. I think thoughtfulness and a bit of skepticism is called for, and I say that as a technologist.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking all of our speakers for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.